It's our first Stardom Sit-em of the year, and the first for Michael F. Florio here on Fantasy Live because he has dethroned Adam Rank. He now does the starts and sits every Wednesday. Go to NFL.com/starts and sits. It was a battle. Rank won last year. He struck Florio down and became more powerful than you could possibly imagine. Also powerful, he put Aaron Rodgers at QB 13. The world reacted to that. Florio, are we starting him here in week one?
Yeah, I didn't have him ranked super high coming in, but I think you start Aaron Rodgers in week one, mainly because they're playing the Minnesota Vikings, and the reigning back-to-back MVP has averaged 27 fantasy points per game in his last 4 starts against them. That includes throwing over 330 yards per game and 13 passing touchdowns in those 4 games. And how's this for a turntables moment? The Packers might need a score to keep up with the Vikings' high-powered offense. And I'd also be starting Trey Lance this week against, I'm sorry, your Bears.
I want this column back.
Lance had the second highest touchdown rate last year. He could put up points with his legs with the best of them. And then the Bears allowed the 6th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, which included the 2nd most rushing touchdowns.
You can't score points from the bench, which is where he'll be in the second half.
Well, Rank's on the bench right now. He's sitting. Who else is sitting at quarterback?
I'm sitting Matthew Stafford, and I'm not just sitting him for anyone, but if you drafted him with, say, another closely ranked quarterback in your draft, it's a week to go with the other quarterback because the Bills last year allowed the fewest fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, but they also just allowed the fewest points in general, the fewest passing yards, and passing touchdowns in the NFL. So get away from Stafford. I'd also get away from Tua Tagovailoa, who I love for the year, but not for the week. Last year, the Patriots allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, including the 2nd fewest passing yards per game, and Tua played them twice, 202 yards or fewer each time and just 1 touchdown.
I'm so glad you had the year caveat because I got a lot of Dolphins going this week. Maybe not good starting, but moving forward, looking forward to it. Let's look forward to some wide receivers. Who are we starting?
I think you're going to start Rashad Bateman this week. A new number 1 target for Lamar Jackson there, and a wide receiver 1 like he's never had before, who could win downfield, win in the red zone, and there's a lot of volume up for grabs with no Marquise Brown there. And last year, the Jets allowed the 5th most fantasy points to wide receivers. And hey, Lamar needs to secure his bag this year, which means good things for his pass catchers. And then I'd also be starting Michael Thomas against the Falcons this week. Why? Because in 10 career games against Atlanta, 7 times he's topped 19 or more fantasy points. And last season, the Falcons allowed the most fantasy points per game to receivers, as well as the most red zone targets. I think Michael Thomas returns in a big way and reminds everyone just how good he is.
Yes, a lot of Taysom in those Michael Thomas highlights, too. Yikes. Let's get some sits at wideout.
I'm sitting Hunter Renfrow. Look, the volume is just not going to be what it was last year with a healthy Darren Waller and now Devontae Adams back. And his style of play is one that relies on volume to put up big fantasy numbers. Plus, it's a tough matchup. The Chargers were tough on wideouts last year, allowing the 4th fewest touchdowns, and their defense got vastly better in the offseason. I'm also going to sit Amari Cooper this week. Jacoby Brissett is his quarterback, and he does not have a lot of help around him to help take defensive pressure away. Plus, the Browns last year had the 2nd lowest target share to wide receivers, while the Panthers allowed the 3rd fewest targets to the position. It is just a recipe for a fantasy disaster.
Oh, yeah, tough spot for Cleveland Browns and folks that got heavily in that pass game, which is the only viable part of that pass game. About the running backs, and some of them that you've looked at this week are all in committee-type situations, so help the people out, starting with Rashad Penny. What are we going to do?
I know Rank just said to sit him. I would be starting Rashad Penny everywhere I have him. Last year, he averaged 134 yards per game in the final 5 weeks, and in that span, if you pick a stat, he likely led running backs in it. Seattle led the NFL in rushing percentage with Pete Carroll as their head coach. You think that's suddenly going to change with no Russell Wilson? They're going to run it even more. Patrick, Kenneth Walker's up in the air, so I guess you could say Penny has the momentum there too. And then I'd also be starting
all the boxes. Wait,
I'd also start A.J. Dillon here against the Vikings. He dropped 22 fantasy points the last time he played them, and I expect more usage for Aaron Jones in the passing game, potentially lining up out wide or anything like that. I think we see a lot of 2 running back sets as well. Dillon last year, when he saw 16 or more touches, averaged over 18 fantasy points per game. I think he's going to get a lot of touches this week.
Yeah, especially considering the news about Allen Lazard. Maybe they lean more heavily on the run game and maybe, just maybe, score a lot of points. Let's look over at the sits. Who are we putting on the bench?
I'm going to sit J.K. Dobbins this week, and that's just because he remains super up in the air. And even if he suits up, we don't know just how much he'll play. It's fair to question how much work he'll see as he recovers from that torn ACL. We know Lamar Jackson will steal carries away himself, and he's not one to target his running backs a whole bunch. So I would just play it safe this week and go in another direction, as long as that other direction is not Miles Sanders, who missed the preseason, much of it himself due to injury, dealing with a hamstring injury, and he already has to worry about Jalen Hurts stealing carries, especially near the goal line. And then Kenneth Gainwell could eat into his targets, and that hurts because Sanders was already 30th amongst running backs last year in touches per game.
Yeah, he got too much grief from Twitter about fantasy, so he's anti-fantasy. He'll be the first person to tell you. He'll say sit Miles Sanders because he's not worried about your fantasy football team. Let's get over to some tight ends. What are we doing with Cole Kmet?
I would be starting Cole Kmet this week and hopefully many weeks moving forward, because volume. I think he is going to be the clear-cut number 2 target behind Darnell Mooney. He led the Bears in red zone targets last year, which bodes well in this matchup because the Niners allowed the 4th most red zone targets to tight ends. I have Cole Kmet ranked as a top 12 tight end this week. Speaking of a top 12 tight end, I have Pat Freiermuth ranked as one as well. Last year, he averaged just under 13 fantasy points per game in 2 games against the Bengals, and he scored a touchdown in each of them. Last season, the Bengals allowed the most fantasy points per game to tight ends. I think that Pat Freiermuth is a tight end 1 this week, but I would be sitting Hunter Henry against the Miami Dolphins. Last year, this guy scored a bunch of touchdowns, but he still averaged less than 5 targets and 3 catches per game. He is a touchdown-dependent tight end going up against a team that only allowed 6 touchdowns to the position. And then, like you mentioned, Matt Patricia's calling plays there. Get away from Hunter Henry and the Patriots offense this week.
Far cry from when he was the big offseason acquisition at the tight end position. More coming up here on Fantasy Live.